occur more than simply supporting one another's struggles, but I think actively being involved in the struggles and understanding it, and understanding why people work on different issues and how to overcome those differences. Often when history is recorded, there's a great deal of misinterpretation and rewriting. The way history is told to us in our textbooks, in the mainstream media, and by the so-called great scholars and historians is not the way it really happened. History is often distorted to downplay the impact of student struggles and undermine the importance and extent of mass movements. I think one of the biggest misinterpretations about the civil rights movement is idolatry of Martin Luther King. We are told that King was the impetus and the sustainer of the movement. And King indeed was a very important figure. He was one whose commitment and mobilizing techniques need to be recognized for their importance. But there were also hundreds and thousands of people who were involved in the civil rights movement. People who sacrificed their families, their friends, and their time to go to marches, to make posters, and to make phone calls. In the Montgomery bus boycott, which was organized by a local group called Women's Political Council, several thousand black people participated in that. Had it not been for these people who chose to walk to work or to give rides to one another rather than to use a segregated bus system, that boycott would have never succeeded. I think the entire civil rights movement was composed of people like this, thousands who were nameless and faceless, whose names will never be in any history book. And it was these people who made the civil rights movement what it was. As Ella Baker, who was a civil rights activist and the founder of SNCC, once said, it was the movement that made King. King didn't make the movement. Another historical myth about the struggle of the 1960s is that it was nonviolent, and that's an issue that's been talked about a lot today. And when activists today express their solidarity with movements such as the Palestinian Liberation Movement in the West Bank and Gaza, or the ANC in South Africa, I think one of the things that happens there, in those movements, violence is much more explicit than we think was in the 1960s. But in fact, the movement in the 1960s, I think, is often looked upon very nostalgically, as if it were a very comfortable struggle, where people only held hands and sang songs all the time. But I think the reality of the situation was very intense violence and confrontation, and it was usually on the part of the police and the National Guard. During the Montgomery bus boycott, black activists had water hoses turned on them to keep them from sustaining their boycott. Children who were 11, 12, and 13 years old in that movement were brutally beaten and seriously injured for their participation. During the Freedom Ride in 1961, which was a strategy to desegregate interstate transportation facilities, the activists there were met with mob violence in Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. They were brutally beaten with sticks and crowbars. Buses were firebombed and shot at. But the black community didn't always respond to this brutality and the entrenched segregation and racial discrimination that they faced. And more importantly, I think the economic violence was simple passivity and by turning the other cheek. Their rage and anger was exemplified by the riots and the rebellions in 1964, 65, and 66, the most well-known of which was the Watts Rebellion in Los Angeles in August 1965, when black youth took to the streets to express their outrage at a system which exploited and marginalized them and their community. So I think the civil rights movement was not a nonviolent movement, as we are often led to believe. The marginalization of the black community, the barriers that activists face to otherwise acceptable forms of protest, and the rather serious challenge that such mass movement posed to a white power structure, ensuring that violence would be a part of that struggle for black equality. But violence in the struggle of the 60s was not just limited to attacks on the black community. It was also white activists who allied with third world struggles that were targeted. Anti-racist whites who were involved in CORE and SNCC and took part in the Freedom Ride sometimes faced as much violence as their black counterparts. In 1964, when SNCC workers were doing community organizing in the Deep South, black and white activists were beaten, shot, or killed. One of the most harrowing moments was when Gloria House and other SNCC activists, including Jonathan Daniels, a white seminarian, who were brought to Alabama, jailed, released, and later ambushed. Daniels was murdered during that incident. And the anti-war movement also, though it was predominantly white, was an alliance with the Third World struggle, the struggle for self-determination in Vietnam and Cambodia. The anti-war movement was clearly a struggle against racism. It is almost exclusively people of color that are targets of U.S. aggression, and it is disproportionately Black and Latino youth that are sent to go fight those battles and that are brought back in coffins. And it is overwhelmingly people of color who are victims of the huge military budget that requires cuts in social services and social programs. Students in SDS were at the forefront of the anti-war movement. They too were met with violence and repression. In October 1967, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, SDS protested against Dow Chemical Company, which was recruiting on their campus. Dow Chemical Company was a manufacturer of napalm. When SDS took over the University Commerce Building, where Dow was holding the interviews, the Madison City Police were called in. They came heavily armed in riot gear. The police smashed in the doors and began to drag students out of the building through the glass. The situation escalated and cops were clubbing heads and began tear gassing students. The repression was severe but temporary. The cops attempted to instill fear into activists and to end their militant actions, but it took only a couple of days to build the momentum back up again. The peak of the repression against SDS took place on May 4th, 1970, during a demonstration that was protesting the U.S. bombing in Cambodia. National Guardsmen were called in and 4 students were murdered at Kent State University. This event was a tragedy that we must never allow to happen again. But I think Kent State was also evidence of the threat that the student movement posed to the existing system. The outrage that followed the Kent State massacre was extensive. Over 4 million students and 1 million others walked out on strike in protest over Cambodia and Kent State. Almost 900 campuses were shut down. There were 2,000 political arrests and 169 bombings of buildings. But 10 days after Kent State, on May 14th, police and state patrolmen at Jackson State College opened fire on a group of Black students. 2 students were killed and 12 injured. But this time, because the students were Black, the response by the media, by white students, and by the public at large was notably muted. One Black civil rights activist sentiment, I think, sums up the feeling of many Black people at the time. She said, when Kent State happened, everybody was shocked. People were appalled that this could happen on a college campus. When Jackson State happened, we weren't shocked. We dealt with this kind of brutality and violence all our lives. This behavior was not out of the ordinary. We were disgusted and angry, but we were not shocked. The lack of the publicity and attention given to the Jackson State killings is another way that history is misconstrued and reshaped. It is our job as 1980s activists to understand what really happened at Kent State and to dig up the information about what happened at Jackson State. There are many lessons that we can extract, both good and bad, from the struggle of the 1960s. One of the lessons is the combination of working for long-term change as well as for short-term change. Our goal to achieve fundamental change and to have a more equal society must be coupled with meeting the needs and the concerns of the Black community and other people who are living in poverty today. We have to give these people food and shelter and a decent education now, as well as talk about the kind of society where we would need to do that kind of work. Second, we must also understand the importance of struggling on all fronts. While we criticize the State Department and the Pentagon for their foreign policy, we must also target elite universities for their exclusion of people of color. We must work on campuses, as well as organize within working class communities and in labor unions. We must work to shape legislative policy as well as welfare policy. And finally, another lesson that we can learn from the 1960s is the importance of making alliances and building coalitions. People doing anti-intervention work, or challenging racism, sexism, and homophobia, or people working on issues directly concerning the Black community, the Latino community, the Asian community, or Native American community, need to come together and show their force and power in numbers. The people united will never be defeated means more than just attending a rally together. It means coming to a common understanding of a common enemy. As Frederick Douglass once said, power yields nothing without a demand, and it is ultimately the power of the people that will determine the progress and change that we make.
I'd like to say thank you to the Kent Organizing Committee for inviting DC SCAR to participate in the panel today. My name is Ray Davis, and I'm Executive Director of DC SCAR in Washington, the Student Coalition Against Apartheid and Racism. We're a community campus coalition of students and youth on 10 campuses in the Washington area that have been fighting racism and apartheid since 1983. I want to begin by saying that, actually confirming, I think, what those of you in this room already know. Just the fact that we are here together today, I think should be clear indication that the student movement in the United States in 1989 is alive, it is well, it's growing, and we're getting a much, much deeper understanding of the issues at this particular point in time. I think that as a student organizer in 1989 in the U.S., and for my fellow panelists as well, I think this is a very opportune time to be an activist in the United States. One of the first lessons, and it has been discussed somewhat today, as far as the 1960s and what we can learn, one of the first lessons is to look at the historical context, and Pam has given us a little bit about that. First of all, I think that we have to look at the 60s as a period of time when the formal colonialized people of the world were in a process of freeing themselves. We're in a process of developing independent states, particularly in Africa, but also in China, as someone has pointed out. It also was a time when America was becoming increasingly involved with the deepening crisis in Vietnam. So all of this had an incredible impact, I think, and the activists here have expressed that, on the student movement at that time. I think that while we're here this weekend, it would be very, very valuable for us to take the time to try to understand what actually happened 20 years ago. What have we learned in the intervening period since then? What mistakes were made, and how can we move forward on a more unified basis and with a more coherent understanding of what it is we're trying to do? That being said, I'd like to, as someone also said this morning, just express how I feel when I see the students in China standing up doing what they are doing. We're talking about students challenging their whole system, the entire system of government, and how important that is for us to understand that that's happening in the current context. That's happening after the period in which many of you all struggled. And so it's still very, very possible. Also, when we look at what's going on in Seoul and all over South Korea, that those students are very, very strong in their fervency and their energy in challenging corruption in that government and demanding that that government change and develop social reforms which will help their people. I think that we today, as students, need to look at those contexts and understand that because we're in the United States, as many people have put it, in the belly of the beast, we have to understand that we have a distinct role to play here. And while the solidarity movements are extremely important, and I got my training and development in the anti-apartheid movement, that we have a lot of work to do right here in the United States in order to hold up our end so that the United States will be ready for social change when the rest of the world is also ready. There's so many things to say. I'm going to try to encapsulate everything and then get to some specific issues. First of all, I think that it's important that we look at the context in which we're talking, when we're talking about coalitions, when we're talking about unifying the student movement, how can we get better crossover throughout it. For DC SCAR, what we have done is to try to prioritize several things. We're a regional coalition, and as part of our organizing work, we've tried to key in on certain key themes that people can grasp and then begin to work around so that we're not trying to hit on too many different things at once. And I'm going to bring up two of those major organizing points now, and I'd be happy to discuss them some more afterward. But I want to be absolutely unequivocal that for us, these are some of the key elements in the struggle today. The first is that from our experience and our understanding, racism, and I want to say it again and underline it, racism was the major unsolved legacy of the 1960s civil rights period. That's where the train came off the track. When it came time to dealing with the hard questions of racial discrimination and difference in this country, that is when the coalitions and the unities that were built in the early parts of the 60s broke up, and we had people going different ways. DC SCAR is dedicated to both a better understanding of racism, very distinctly and very directly, and also an end to racism in all of its debilitating and negative effects for people of color in this society today. The final goal of that would be to create a society or create an opportunity for future generations to create a society that is truly multicultural and one in which diversity is celebrated among people and not exploited. That is how we see a vision for where we want to head. The other thing that we try to emphasize in our work and are keyed in on very specifically is that there is a major and worsening crisis today for people of color and their access to the university, their access to higher education. We have underlined that, we have tried to emphasize that, and have tried not only with the greater left, but also within people of color communities to emphasize that this is a critical problem that must be addressed now. Let me take that another step. We think that there's a crisis for youth in this country today in general. We have an America where opportunities are lessening dramatically, where underfunded urban education is causing problems for all of our youth, and where drugs are threatening to ruin a generation. So we've got a whole crisis among young people to deal with. And then let me take it just one step further, and that as we look at those problems, we can see that that also impacts also disproportionately upon low-income people in general, regardless of their race. It impacts on women, it impacts on gay, bisexual, and lesbian groups, and it also impacts on the differently abled. And so we've been trying to push these kinds of issues, to key in on those kind of things. So I wanted to highlight that to begin with. To sort of round this out, and then stay, and while at the same time staying on the same track, I want to key in on a couple of things that are often paid lip service to within the new student movement or the student movement today, but not really often filled out. The first one is this whole notion of curricular reform and what is meant by curricular reform today, and what does it mean when we see all of these protests going on. New Mexico, Wayne State University, Ann Arbor, Amherst, all over the place. Why are they fighting for an end to racism? Why are they fighting for changes in the curriculum? And the second thing I want to talk briefly about, and I'd like to get some more impact from the folks who were here at Ken in the late 60s, early 70s, is the role of COINTELPRO and the role of the intelligence forces within the student movement at that time and today, because I don't think enough emphasis is placed on that. What are we talking about when we say curricular reform? Well, basically I think there's two levels to that. The one level that most everyone seems to have dealt with and which seems more clearly identifiable for people is this whole notion of either ethnic studies programs or cultural theme houses, cultural dorms, what have you. That's sort of been, after you all were coming out of the struggle in the late 60s, that's where it sort of moved. Also, the African American students at that time were very adamant about trying to get black studies departments, about trying to get theme houses, this kind of thing. I think that particularly on the predominantly white campuses, what many white students fail to understand is that the ethnic studies programs and the cultural theme houses make up a very important support system for students of color on those campuses. When those students have to go to classes, as Pam so well enlightened, have to go to classes where A, there usually maybe only 2 or 3 other students of color in the class to begin with. B, the professor is quite often not sympathetic to differing views, differing interpretations of history, what have you, when the curriculum and the books that they're studying do not reflect their values, their background, that's when students of color begin to feel extremely alienated on predominantly white campuses. To be able to come back to, as I did at Oberlin, because that's where I went, and I was president of the Black Student Organization there my senior year, to be able to go back to African Heritage House made a big difference for us. To be able to go somewhere where we could sit amongst ourselves, talk one time in the day, after having been a quote-unquote minority all day long in every aspect of our experience at the campus, sitting in the cafeteria, everything. To be able to come back there and have that time to ourselves was very, very important. Same thing with the ethnic studies programs. It gives us mentoring, faculty guidance, because that's primarily where faculty of color are located and who often form the role models for us. Those are also the departments that articulate very clearly our experience. So that's one level. The larger level that we've been struggling around in DC SCAR is the whole notion of changing the entire educational system, as the gentleman was saying up here a little while ago, reforming, reshaping, redeveloping. Today's curriculum in America is overwhelmingly Eurocentric in its focus. Ethnocentric, but Eurocentric very specifically. We are given very little, and this goes all the way back to primary school, and I think many of you understand exactly what I'm talking about. That when I was in 3rd grade, and we had a section in our history book, our social studies book, on Latin America, or on Africa, it was tiny in comparison to what we studied in European history. We studied the Reformation. We studied the Renaissance. We had periodized European history. As far as African history, especially as related to this country, the first thing in my primary school history book was a picture of a slave being taken off of a ship, as though there was nothing back in Africa that had any value, that had any relevance at all to the greater whole of the world. And so this is what we're talking about, the so-called classics. What are the classics? Who are these people? And why is their history and knowledge any better than anyone else's? These are the kind of questions. These are the kind of questions that students of color are asking very directly. And so when we're talking about curricular reform on that level, what we're talking about is a whole rewriting of history, social science, languages. Why is it that we only get certain languages and not others? You know, why is there this emphasis? That kind of thing. Textbooks, rewriting textbooks. We've been very adamant about that, and although it has yet to really build, one of the things that we've talked about trying to do is to target some of these companies. Target Harper and Row. Target Random House. Why are they not writing certain things and writing others? Why are they leaving out whole segments of history? That's what curriculum reform is all about, and of course it connects to faculty and women faculty, faculty of color rather, and women faculty. We need to get more people teaching these experiences within our classrooms. Our classrooms are still overwhelmingly dominated by white males. And that's not to say that white males don't have quite a bit to add to the experience of students, but certainly other people. That's important to know. But there are many other people that also have quite a bit to add. And certainly women of color, have quite a bit to add to those experiences. So to move off of that, I want to touch quickly on this COINTELPRO thing. I brought this up many times at student conferences around the country and have been a little bit distressed about the fact that there hasn't been a whole lot of response around it. I hope that you 60s activists, the Kent SDS people, would maybe elaborate a little bit more on your experiences with the authorities. I think the woman who presented up here today really catalyzed some things in my mind. I'll tell you this quite clearly, as an activist of color, particularly a male activists of color, I have very few illusions in my mind as to what this system is willing to do to me if I step too far, if I say what they think is extremely dangerous. As I was talking with some people this morning about the history of the Black Panthers, one only has to look at what happened to those brothers and sisters to realize that if you get to a certain point in the struggle, they are quite capable and quite willing to deal with you dramatically. Clark and Hampton, when they were ambushed in Chicago, had very little, I mean, there was no chance to do anything. There wasn't a chance to move, there wasn't a chance to do anything. And the reason that I bring this up is twofold. One, because I think in many cases there's a misunderstanding within the left as to the extent to which black students are down for the struggle, or really down to get down and dirty. I think if there were any illusions about that, that what happened at Howard University ought to begin to turn on some light bulbs. But also I think we have to look at the fact that black students are very overburdened, particularly on predominantly white campuses, with all of the different struggles they have to deal with institutional racism. To then go out on the line and sit in, maybe be thrown out of school, have to deal with their family back home, this scraping to get them there in the first place is sometimes very difficult. The other thing that we've dealt with in DC, in terms of big nonviolent demonstrations, is getting African Americans, other people of color, to participate in nonviolent civil disobedience. One issue that I think needs to be made quite clear, and I think some people may understand it, is that quite often the police authorities deal with white activists and people of color activists in very, very different ways. If I and many of my other brothers are arrested at a nonviolent civil disobedience action and taken into a back room by the PD, we may not come out alive. And I think that it's very, very important to understand that when we're dealing with people of color and trying to get them involved in the movement, take people at the stages at which they are and try to work with them and develop them. The other reason I bring that up, and I think that today's student movement is missing a little bit of it, a little bit of what you all had, is this greater organizational cohesiveness. It starts with the personal, in terms of personal relations, and then it works out between different organizations working together. And I think that, I mean, I've sat in anti-apartheid meetings, I've sat at student conferences where just as it seemed when we were about to get something accomplished, all of a sudden somebody would stand up in the back and start yelling some kind of crazy madness, and folk would be arguing, and there would go the whole meeting to pot. And I think that we have to understand that that may not just be happening by chance. And that in fact, we have found, after looking back at the 60s, after documents have been released, that the Black Panther Party, that SDS, that SCLC, that SNCC, all of these organizations were to some degree monitored, watched, phones were tapped, misinformation was distributed. There was all kinds of stuff going on by the intelligence services that were hurting the development of the movement. So the point I'm making is that we, as today's activists, need to be very cognizant of the fact that this still exists, and begin to deal with it and structure ourselves so that we'll be ready. We need to be working with as younger people as possible. High school students, if you can, freshmen, sophomores, get them ready so that when you're either graduating or maybe you've been isolated, the administration has kicked you off campus, the thing continues. If they feel as though certain people can be isolated and taken off, then it becomes easy to just do that. I'm going to wrap up because I guess I've been a little bit long-winded and I didn't want to be. But I just wanted to bring up a couple of quick points in terms of lessons from the 60s. As I said a little earlier, I think unity and broad coalitions are very key, and that within that we have to understand that there's going to be disagreement. And when we disagree, and move on. And the idea of a coalition, which many people misunderstand when they think about coalition, is that a coalition gets together independent groups around a single issue or issues about which they have agreement. Not so that those groups can get together and argue about what they don't agree about. So we need to get back to that point. We need to deepen the leadership base. We need to develop practical, pragmatic solutions for the problems in our communities. We can't, as social activists, just be speaking a whole lot of rhetoric and air if no one in the community is listening, and if we can't provide real solutions to those people's problems. Otherwise, we're irrelevant. And I think that it's important that we become more relevant and we start answering some of the hard questions and dealing with some of the hard issues that exist in our communities. And last, what has been expressed here today is that we do deal with male-female relations much better throughout the movement. And I'll be the first to stand up here and say, and as many sisters have enlightened me, that the 1960s, the Brothers and the Panthers and the other organizations, a lot of that was very sexist. It was very wrong. The sisters were shunted to the back and they weren't allowed to speak. And I can tell you, the sisters, for me, have been the biggest inspiration all the way throughout my growth and development. I thank you for your time, and we would be happy to engage in more discussion and dialogue later today. Thank you.
My name is Joe Osbaker, and I'm with the Progressive Student Network from the University of Illinois in Chicago. For all the former SDS regional meeting people, they used to call it Circle, but now they've got a Harvard on Halstead complex, and they don't want to refer to it as that. I'm going to just say two things first, and then I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Kim. Kent PSN.
Same thing.
All right. I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Progressive Student Network. And the reason that I was given that job to do is because the PSN is actually going to be 9 years old this year. It was formed in 1980, and I'm the sole surviving member of the first round. And so I was designated to give this presentation. And I guess the first thing to say is that somebody said before something about a missing generation. I feel like I'm part of a missing generation coming to politics in the late 1970s when I arrived at campus and there were about half a dozen campus hangovers, we used to call them, left around in the 60s who were still agitating. And I look back now and realize that it has been longer since I got politically active than it was between that time and the end of the 60s. Yeah, I know, it's right, I just turned 30. But it is important to remember, point number one, that the 70s were not dead. People refer to it sometimes as a non-decade, and say that there were no struggles taking place. That's not true. For the women's liberation movement, for the gay and lesbian liberation struggles, for the environmental movement, the 70s were the period when those movements were born and blossomed and went in directions that have profoundly affected all of our lives. And I think that to say the 70s were dead denies those struggles their own histories. I think it's certainly true that the 70s, relatively speaking, were a ebb period compared to, not just in this country, but the international upsurge for social transformation that took place. The second thing is how this ties into the history of PSN. In the late 70s, a number of single issues began to impact on American people that had ripples on the college campuses. And there began a phenomenon of a series of waves of activism. It was out of those initial single issues that the Progressive Student Network was born. The first wave of activism that struck the campuses in the era following the end of the Vietnam War was a movement for divestiture from South African invested corporations, which began in the wake of the Soweto uprising of 1976. Following that, the next wave of activism occurred in the days and weeks after the near meltdown that took place in a nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. The first wave of activism that was, I think, largely rooted on the campuses was when Jimmy Carter in January of 1980 called for a return to draft registration. And we saw dozens of campuses around the country have spontaneous demonstrations. The Progressive Student Network came into existence in November of 1980 when a number of single-issue networks came together and held a conference. We planned it for 2 weekends after the election because a lot of us were active in the election that year, and we really did not believe that Ronald Reagan was going to be the president, so we were planning a meeting of 50 to 100 people, and 400 and some showed up. And it was actually held here at Kent State, as a matter of fact, and so it's great to be back here once again. There continues to be this phenomenon of waves of struggle. Some people refer to it as like an episodic nature of the student movement. I guess I just want to say that some of it has been covered before, but providing continuation between these different waves of struggle, I guess, is one of the main reasons that the PSN was brought into existence and that we still work today. And now Kim's going to talk some more about what the PSN is about.
My name is Kim, and PSN's chapter started at Kent State in 1986. Thank you. When former Governor Rhodes decided to run for re-election, and we all know what happened when he was governor of Ohio back in the 70s. So a bunch of students got together and decided to let these people remember what he did back in 1970. And once he got successfully defeated, a lot of students from that group, they were wondering what he could do next, and someone remembered PSN was in here in 1980, so that's how the chapter got started. We started with the divestment issue, and along with other college campuses, there was like waves of struggle. The CIA off campus was a big issue too, and I guess a lot of other campuses got together and decided to form a network, which is probably different from SDS. We've got 30 chapters, mainly in the northeast part of the country, a few out in California and down in the south. And we decided to have a network between these campuses. That way we can get together and form national days of action. So on a certain day, everyone will be doing action on an issue or many issues. And this is a great network that we have because we also get information from other campuses and say, hey, we're doing this kind of issue, why don't you join us? And we open dialogue with other campuses. So that's part of our network. We get together like 3 times a year, discuss major issues on our campuses, and then we get together to form more good communications on what we can do, different tactics that other campuses use, and maybe we can use that tactic that we haven't thought of on our campus, and lo and behold, it just might work. Locally, we do what we do on our campus the best that we know, and then we get together and discuss what is happening. We're unified in that sense, but we also work on our local campuses the way we want to do. We take different actions. It all depends what kind of campus you're on. It all depends what action, because some campuses are more militant than some others. We have a lot of different ideological campuses, and that's very apparent when we get together. A lot of people have different philosophies, but we're actually working through the philosophies. We acknowledge everyone has different philosophies, but we want to get together and work on the issue and the tactics we can use. So this leads to be very flexible. We let people speak their minds, but we also have a place and time to discuss real tactics. And our basic philosophy is based on in struggle. Our motto is staying in struggle, and it is a big struggle for many campuses, and we want to keep letting people know that they should be educated and struggle at the same time. We are building a multinational unity. Our big emphasis is building coalitions with DC SCAR, UCAR, and other different kinds of organizations. That way we will have networks working with other different types of groups, and will make the student movement stronger. And I really believe that we really have to work together to let people of America know that we're not going to sit by very passively and let them rule us. We want to rule them, and we want to say what we want to see happen in our country. we also, well, since we also learned from SDS and the student movements from the past about the male domination. We know it's out there, and PSN has been trying to work to get more equal on sexism and more or less try to get sexism out of their campuses. It's still a very hard struggle because we're still socialized to teach others that men, know the answers and women are just supposed to sit back. But through our struggle and letting each other know that we all are very important, we are trying to overrule the male domination. And I guess I should say that we had a national steering committee meeting, and was it 75% were women? And there was a majority of women there, or 75% of the leaders in PSN are women. So we are making good strides. We're still struggling, we're still making mistakes, but at least we know how to deal with it and how to move on. And PSN is also embracing women's liberation. We have a women's caucus and a men's group. And the women's caucus is great because it empowers women who ordinarily probably wouldn't want to talk in front of men because of their past history and men interrupting and being dominating. Women are very intimidated, but as we find out, when you empower women with other women, they're more vocal and they can stand up on their own, which is really great because that's why I can speak up here with no problem.
One more thing. Earlier, Bernadine suggested that there might be a women's gathering sometime this weekend. I don't know if that's going to happen. If it does, if you'd like, one thing that I've learned from being in the PSN is the concept of alternative discussion groups for the white, straight males among us to deal with our role in these liberation struggles. I'd be willing to, gather together men or help to have a discussion on the other side. Just
I second it. That's a great idea.
Only if you grant men too. So I always bring that up when women are being laid down on men. I mean, they're victims as much as we are, but we have to empower them. Also, when we get together with these meetings with all these different campuses, we've been through the disruption from certain groups, and we are learning to deal with them. We know who they are, and it's deliberate, fortunately, but a lot of other campuses have expressed miscommunication, and I guess it just goes through the part of the roles that we play. But we're working on this and building more democracy in our own PSN network. So we are opening up communication lines, and we are accepting a lot of people with different philosophies. But the important thing is that we get by that and work together to get things done. And also, everyone knows, as you said, that the Pentagon action was a big thing, and it was sponsored by CISPS, and a third of the people down there were students. Students are playing a big role, and CISPS really enjoyed the students being down there. And about the different tactics that we used, there was many different kinds of tactics, all the way from rallies, posters, to civil disobedience, to spray painting, to burning a Pentagon effigy. So there was many different kinds of tactics. Of course, there was many different kinds of philosophies. But the really good thing is that certain students that did one tactic who believed in nonviolent tactics were in support of other people doing other kind of tactics. They weren't overbearing each other and saying that you're wrong in your tactic and you should do this. They basically said, your tactic's good, we'll do ours and we'll help you later. And I wasn't down there, so I'm just paraphrasing what we went over. And also, Mark Rugg's letter in The Guardian, we want to thank you for putting in that article in The Guardian, mainly because we fostered debate within our group when we had our steering committee meeting to talk about the different tactics that we used. And I hope you read the letter from Bruce, Nestor, and Becky Minich. And hopefully we got things cleared up. And I just want to say
Actually, I think it misstated my position. It was good.
Okay, but anyhow, it fostered great debate in our PSN chapters, and it's just to let us know that there are many different tactics out there. So, yes, that's about it.
Just, I know this question always comes up with like, what the veterans of the 60s can do to support students of today. And so I'm going to preempt that by answering that question. One thing that students today really need is financial support. And I'm sure all three organizations present on the dais here would be glad to talk to anyone who has access to or information about foundation funding or anything like that. One concrete thing you can do is, I know that DC SCAR and PSN both put out national newsletters. Many students can't afford to have the actual, don't get around to getting their subscription monies in. Having grown-ups taking out subscriptions and actually paying for them, it's sort of like adopting a half a dozen student activists. So that's my plug for.
Graduated students, because it is really difficult to get out there and speak your own mind when you don't have a lot of people behind you. So it's really great that support like rallies and different kinds of struggles, and just like writing letters or doing anything to let the students know that it's okay that you are questioning your government. That's good, because a lot of people are getting on TV saying, these students don't know what they're doing and they should be thrown into Siberia just because they're saying that our government isn't a good government. So just by your vocal support will make us feel a little bit better and a little bit more sure of what we're doing is right.
Well, if anybody wants to ask any questions, you have 5 minutes and make it short, and you don't have to come up to the front because we want to get Mark in and Bill Schultz also has to speak. So yes, Alan, would you like to say something?
Just one question. Could members of the panel comment about the announced plans for the 20th anniversary observation next year of the shootings here at Kent State and Jackson State, for a national march here for students during that weekend, and also the national conference to announce that student activism is alive and well in the 1990s next year? I think everybody should talk about that and focus on that and make plans to build that for next year. Can we have some comments about that?
Okay, since we don't have a lot of time, that was supposed to be one of our workshops, actually, because we do want everyone's opinion on it. So hopefully, at this party, we can continue discussions, and we won't have like too much loud music to disrupt us or anything, but maybe that'll be an area to get together.
Tell them where the party is, Jim.
The Labor Temple, there's maps. Just check out old Kent members and me, and we know where it's at, so just maps right there.
My name is Steve Powery. I'm from Cotton Falls. I attended the University of Buffalo at New York, otherwise known as UB. And during that magical year, it seemed like it was 5 years, but it seems like it was only a little more than a year. I was, I guess, for a while, the most active member of SDS there. These press plates from Red Star 1 belong to me. I have the banner of the Buffalo 9, which some of you have seen, I suppose, in Washington, D.C. I've been carrying it around for 20 years. One of the projects that I wanted to see develop in Buffalo or anywhere in the country is kind of what Bernie was talking about, how the the media and the bourgeoisie take what we did and they pervert it. I think there's something we can do about it, and I'm just going to be very brief and throw out this idea. Perhaps we can exchange some phone numbers and addresses. I think that this country needs, well, first let me say what Tom Grace said the other day really struck me because I hadn't thought of it. That when we're all gone in the year 2030, people should go out to this campus and they should know what those people are like. That memorial should be built. Not only for the people of 2030, but 2075. Forever. They should know as long as humanity lives on this planet why those people died. One of the things that we could do is establish a museum. And I think it's something that it's difficult, it's hard, but we can do it. You know? I've got 2 boxes of stuff. And I'm tired of lugging it around the country. You know?
And I'm tired of helping.
Yes. Well, he copped out. When he moved from Cape Cod, he said, Speed, I'm tired of it. This is yours. And I have drug it from Cape Cod. I'm tired of it too. Let's just exchange some ideas. This debate, I must say, I was alarmed at what I heard earlier that people were talking about those type of tactics today. I'm not going to get into that now. We have a wealth of information. The speakers that have spoken here in these last 2 days have been incredible. And it's been as magical as those original years. That needs to be seen by a lot of people and studied so that they can make intelligent decisions upon what they do in the future. In any event, I'm going to be around. Let's kick around the idea. We'll see what can happen. So I'll just be around. That's all I have to say. I think we really need a museum so that the bourgeoisie does not write our history. Thank you.
Maybe I'll talk too much.
Would you like to say something?
I have a question for the on-panel ones that answer it, but I was in conversation with Joe, so I'll start there. I'm from Chicago, and we were putting together a citywide coalition which consisted of the people who were opposing CIA involvement in South Africa, or Southern Africa, the Philippines, and in Central America, which brought together a wide coalition with students. And in the course of conversation with the Progressive Student Network, kind of going, gee, don't you do something to active and stand up to leaflets, I found out that the students were actually very involved with the non-campus things that were going on, like Pledge of Resistance, primarily non-campus, CISPA, primarily non-campus, and anti-Operation Rescue movement, etc. And the impression that I got was that, Joe, in fact, Joe, your response was, our students are being pulled off campuses to do this other work. And I'm kind of curious now, it sounds like there's a that's going on. On one hand, it sounds like there's a marvelous coalition that's going on. But on the other hand, I'm wondering to what extent is the student work now actually immersed in other organizational structures? And what I'm asking, it sounds like there's kind of a hidden student activism that's going on. Even if we're not hearing about it exploding yet, we're still finding that the students are very much involved in the work that's going on elsewhere. Is that true?
I mean, I think that's a real good point. I think that's been one of the problems in the student movement in recent years has been that there's not this sense of a solid grounding. There's somewhat of a transient nature to it. People come into school, graduate in 4 years. There's not always something they can get their teeth into, and that especially becomes acute once you leave a particular campus. In other words, the students on that campus may be very mobilized around issues that relate to their specific campus experience. But when it comes to linking that to other campuses, be it regionally, when it comes to linking that to the national issues, it sometimes becomes harder. What we've done in DC, because our coalition sort of functions like that, I mean, I'm a member of other organizations, I mean, that are pro-African American and the like. You're finding many students around the Solidarity movement that will function in various organizations, NECA, CSPES, so on and so forth. Students that will function within many environmental organizations, but also be a part of something else. So I guess I think, and maybe Joe and some of the other people would agree, is that we are reaching a different point in the student struggle. And I think that the key to that, to understanding that on two levels, is to look at Howard University and to look at CUNY and SUNY. And I think that when you look at those, then you can see, okay, there's something going on here, and then you've got established organizations, what begins to happen if they move together?
I'd just like to say at Ann Arbor too, I think our struggle has been changing over the past 4 years that I've been involved. We're working much more closely with the Black community in Ann Arbor. And one of the ways specifically that we're trying to overcome this lack of continuity that that people were talking about is by establishing a Center for Anti-Racist Education. We've called it the Elevate Nelson Mandela Center. And we'd like it based in the Black community, and we'd like people to be there even when students are going to be graduating after 4 years. I think that those are the kinds of concrete things that people can do so that when you do graduate and leave, there is something left behind and it's not simply a memory.
We don't have time for any more questions because we have to move on, sorry. But I'd like to, if we'd all could thank the student panel once more. Moving right along, Mark was supposed to speak at 11 o'clock this morning, and it's now almost 6, so I think that he's a very patient man. And I thank you very much for being so patient and waiting for so long to talk.
How about a 5-minute break?
No.
If everybody feels like I do, I
Oh, we
couldn't
have to be
sit.
out of here by 6.
What? We'll get out by 6.
It's okay.
We have 2 speeches, so yeah, we better get going.
All right, okay, let's move now.
Everybody stand up and stretch.
All right, everybody get up.
7th inning stretch.
7th inning stretch.
I was just informed that it really is not exactly 6 o'clock is the problem. I'm really happy to have waited till the end, or close to the end, because you don't have to, it doesn't matter. I'm kind of happy to have waited this long because it takes the pressure off. Because there's some stuff that needs talking about that may take a while. I tried to write down my ideas when Ellen asked me. I did short a form as I could, and I came out with something like 5,000 words, and that's a lot of words. It's a lot of time. I gave it to friends. I cut it down to 3,500. It's still 3,500 words. A lot of words, you know. It's plenty of words. It takes 25, 30 minutes to get through. I still have that, and I would like to deliver my paper, which has been brewing for 19 years, on Terry Robbins. First, I think it is necessary to thank some people and to make a few comments. And also, I want to comment on last night's session, more than anything, or as a starting point, because well, I'll get into that in a second. First, I have these numbers. This is 0 comment. I put this in this. I promised the students at University of New Mexico that I would tell you something about what they're doing. The reason is not only because it's an important struggle and it's consistent with all these other struggles, but also because it's unique. It's got a great comparison to the 60s. We held a discussion 2 weeks ago in which we talked about the differences between their struggle at University of New Mexico and the 60s. I've been hanging around there and I made a number of observations. Well, first of all, the issues. The first starting point of it was the fact that the regents of the university raised tuition $100 a year. Tuition actually is very low. I think it's probably about half of what it is here. However, it's an extremely poor state. 5% unionized labor force, less than 4% unionized labor force. It's typical for a welder, for example, to make $4.50 an hour. It's incredible what goes on in New Mexico. Extremely poor. Among the poorest in the United States. The so-called minority population is a majority of the population. And the Anglos, who are what you call whites, are the minority. And it's a class setup that's horrendous, and it hurts students a lot. However, they define the struggle not just as money, but as access, democratic access, access for minority people and for women. Tremendous number of single mothers there. The average age of the University of New Mexico is 28. Anyway, I could go on about them, talking about them, but the differences are what's amazing. They held a spontaneous occupation. That spontaneous occupation happened with no violence, no threats of violence, no confrontations with police. They were entirely focused on their goals, which were access, democracy, and also, incidentally, participation of students in the budget process. They were entirely focused on their goals, and they were entirely, they did nothing extraneous. They were disciplined to these goals. Now, two of the most amazing aspects of it is the leadership of the group was over half women. In 1970, there was a similar kind of strike at UNM. No women in the leadership. 1968 at Columbia University, no women were allowed into the leadership at Columbia University. Big difference. I went around there and I asked guys, especially, I said, well, was this a big struggle for women, or how did you feel? They said, well, they looked at me like I was crazy. I mean, it was automatic. Women will take leadership. And the difference is enormous. It's between night and day, and I think it has repercussions in the kind of struggle and the kind of tactics, strategies and tactics. Now, I'll get into that in my talk on Terry Robbins. Secondly, the struggle is led by not only by women, but the large majority of the leadership are non-white. And it's entirely an integrated struggle. And the Chicanos and Native Americans, there are no black people who were involved in the leadership. There are very few in the occupation. Very tiny black population in Mexico. The student leaders are very clear that they are righting hundreds of years of wrongs by taking leadership. And the white people discuss it, it's discussed openly, and it's my opinion, I told this to them, and they wanted me to tell it to you, it's my opinion that they are miles ahead of where we were 20 years ago. So I just wanted to say that. I wanted also to thank the people who have worked so hard on this, and Kendra, who especially has been out struggling with the money and the registration, and Tom Grace, and all the people from PSN, and especially Alan Canfora, who I did. There's something magical about this conference. It's worked out great. I don't know if it's intuitive on Alan's part, or I meant it's not just it's not just intuitive. It's planned. It's planned. The session last night was perfect, as far as I was concerned. The panel this morning was perfect. The afternoon, the panelists, the afternoon, everything is just right. I was scared about whether my role would be wrong or would blow it or something. He's encouraged me, and what I'm trying to do is something a little out of the ordinary. He's encouraged me, and this. I am absolutely convinced that if Alan decides that there's going to be a memorial to the 4 people killed on May 4th, that memorial will come into existence. And he now has a foundation, the
Kent May 4th Center.
Kent May 4th Center, which you are the executive director.
That's right.
And I pledge my support to do whatever I can to bring this into existence, and I hope everybody also does. And we will do it. There's no question we will build that memorial. It's essential that we build it.
I want to point out that I've had a lot of help here. It hasn't just been me. Progressive Student Network, a lot of people in that other room, Tom Grace in Buffalo, and a lot of the Kent SDSers really put a lot of work into organizing this thing too. Actually, the Kent SDS organized it themselves. So let's hear it for the Kent SDS. They made a lot of phone calls, they contacted each other, and that's how I think it happened.
Spontaneous organization.
But you made us do it.
The Kent SDS group is a unique group. It was always unique. I can't explain what the chemistry or the dynamic is. I feel very privileged to be accepted as a provisional member of the group. I feel that there are two groups. There are two groups that I feel really tight with. You know, one is I'm very fortunate living in New Mexico. I have a group of activists I've been working with for for up to 11 years. And among it is the New Mexico Construction Brigade to Nicaragua. And we've sent lots of people down. I went down in '86. 21 of us on our first trip. And of those 21, I would say 19 of us are as tight as can be. And we're going to be tight for a long time. And I feel that in New Mexico I have maybe 50 people I can call on. And you know, or they can call on me and we can do what needs to be done. And it's the same way here with you Kent SDS people. That, for want of a better phrase, Carl used this. Carl and I stayed up all night talking, and the night before. Carl used this phrase. These are people you can go to the trenches with. And
Let's go.
Well, the reason I'm a little scared about the phrase "the trenches," you'll see in a second. But there's something very special about it, and I feel honored to be asked here and to be given this much time, and I thank you. A year ago, I attended the 20th anniversary of Columbia SDS, and that was so terrible, it took me 6 months to recover. I could not get out of bed for 6 months, virtually, I mean metaphorically. You know, it was just a disaster in my life. My role in it was terrible. The people, I didn't like the people. Everything was a mess. I just didn't like it. I haven't had so much fun in a 24-hour period in a long time. You know, not since I left New Mexico, certainly, which was on Wednesday. But I'm kind of a New Mexico show. Anyway, don't come. Don't come. I think the difference, it's worth noting what the difference is, at least my perception of what the difference was, because it was raised a lot since last night, the question of class. Jim Powery raised it, I guess Howie raised it, a lot of people raised it. At Columbia, you have, well, there were 350 people there at the reunion, and out of those 350, 394 were lawyers. and there were a lot of professionals who were doing good work. But they were not asking the questions that are being asked here now, and especially starting from the minute we all got together, which is, what do we do now? And what are our responsibilities? And how do we keep going? And people, I think, have a sense of deep, long-term responsibility to themselves. And maybe that's the difference of class. I don't know. Columbia's upper middle class. or to ruling class. Kent is, I disagree with Jim when he used the term working class. I think working class is such a broad term, it's virtually meaningless. To me, Kent is the upper reaches of the working class, or rather the most ambitious and the smartest of people from working class families come to Kent. And maybe that's the reason why Kent SDS is so great. So anyway, as a member of the lower upper middle class Jewish suburban New Jersey division, I would like to say thank you for letting me be here and join the upper reaches of the anyway, northeastern Ohio division of, anyway, you get the idea. Last night's panel, the slideshow kind of shocked me. I don't know if other people had the same reaction to the slideshow that I did. And I want to talk about that slideshow because that's a lead-in to talking about the person who was shown as the last slide, the last picture in the slideshow, Terry Robbins, who died May 4th. March 6, 1970, 2 months before the shootings here. I was going to comment on do you mind if I do this rap a little? Is it okay if I go ahead?
Please.
Okay.
Do it.
Just before I get into the slideshow, the panel that was here was an example, I think, of fabulous planning. Because the panel established attention. If people weren't here, it was a panel between Howie Emmer made a presentation and followed by Jim Powery. Howie's could be grossly defined as the ideological tendency, right? Sort of like, although to me it was more like Mr. Rogers storms the Winter Palace. Which I say with all due, with love. You know, I adore you. It's one of the greatest things that came out of this. You know, was seeing you, and I wish my kids were in Chicago and could be your students. That's the way I feel, you know. Jim, I think, could be characterized as kind of the voice of the tendency of realism, right? And I think that's a good tendency, a good dynamic, because between realism and ideology is reality somewhere, and we're always trying to go towards that. So that panel last night was brilliant, and it really established us. You know, mentioning Howie Emmer, I wanted to say something that's been on my mind 20 years to say publicly to the Emmers. Most of you may not know, but at one point in the fall of 1969, the entire northern Ohio faction, weatherman faction of SDS, moved into the Emmers' home.
And the Michigan.
What?
And the Michigan region.
And the Michigan, I'd forgotten that. And it's been on my mind for 20 years, you know. And I've been thinking about you folks and what must have been in your minds. And I think the best thing I can say is I hope that I am the kind of parent, I have a 15-year-old and 11-year-old, who can have so much love and respect I hope I can have that much love and respect for my children, that even though I do disagree with them, even though you thought we were nuts politically, and you were right, even so, you opened everything, and you were there for us. And I can see why Howie is the kind of person he is.
But I didn't think everything was nuts.
That's That's great, that's fine. I don't know, are there any reporters here? There were this morning. I would ask you, I'm going to be saying some things that are
Off the record.
thank you, off the record. I don't know if that has any weight. I appeal to your sense of humanity to just don't report these things, because when they are reported out of context, they'll look terrible. They'll be a total gross distortion. And one of the things is I can now say these things because the context has been established. But it took 24 hours to establish that context. Right? And so I appeal to you, don't report these things. Because what this is going to be a person who's very troubled, emotionally troubled, who has 20 years of stuff to put out and try to figure out, at the end of which it will be done, and I won't have to do it anymore, and maybe I will speak for some people and not for others, and maybe I will never have to do it again. So I feel like I will never have this opportunity, I probably will never have this opportunity again, and I've never had it before. And that's why I'm demanding so much of your attention, because, well, anyway. So please, you could tell your editor, I'll give you a copy of my speech for Thursday, and you could tell your editor I slammed the war in Vietnam and war in Central America and backed the student movement and built the memorial. That would be a good report of my talk. However, my real talk is going to start by mentioning the slideshow yesterday. There were some really fabulous things in there, like seeing Colin Nyberger, as a mafia hood, But he was beautiful, and he's beautiful now, and seeing all the people as we were young. And it brought back some fabulous memories. But overall, I was kind of freaked out by it. There was a lot of violence. Now, of course, we know the context. Context is quite clear. It's been talked about endlessly. And yet we were part of that context, and it entered into us, and we saw those pictures. Jim Howery's comment, the battle was lost at the moment you squared off against the jocks at the music and speech building. I think he was absolutely right. And it raised a lot of questions in my mind. One, I will not even say, I will only allude to. I'm sure that every one of us who was alive on May 4th, it passed through our minds, and I won't even say what that was. But you can imagine something passed through our minds when we thought about those 4 children, and something about ourselves in the previous 2 years, and I won't even say. The second thing that it brought to mind is, and I know what the correct line is. The correct line is that the state killed those 4 kids. I know the correct line. Howie Hammer gave it to me last night. We gave it to all of us. But there's still something that's always been troubling me, and we can talk about that maybe privately, outside. The second thing that's been troubling me really came to me within an hour or so coming on campus on Wednesday evening. This is an incredibly cold place. There's no support for the memorial. It's very little, relatively little, and I don't mean the campus, I mean in northeastern Ohio. I had a heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking discussion with the Scheuers, these lovely people who have been ostracized in Youngstown, Ohio, from their community because they stood by the memory of their daughter. And even in their synagogue, the rabbi won't have anything to do with them on this question. Nobody will. They're incredibly brave people. I met the Camforas, fabulous people. Both parents and people in the family have been arrested multiple times, and they're more or less ostracized, less than the Scheuers. And when there's talk about the memorial, there's not an outpouring of support. And there's something about that slideshow that I just want to ask a question before I get into talk about Terry, because it's related. Is there something that we did in the build-up toward May 4th that muddied the waters, that made things less clear for people? Now, granted, there's a tremendous conservative backlash. There's conservative vested interests, like the American Legion, who talks to the president here and tells him it's a bunch of terrorists, and a lot and don't build a memorial. There's tremendous conservative backlash. But you would have thought, in 20 years' time, that there would be at least a growth of understanding among some people about the true nature of what happened on May 4th, and therefore building a memorial. There does not appear to have been much growth. Maybe we should look to our actions and ask the question. I'm sure I'm wrong on this, yes.
Okay, as a descendant of African people, as well as Native Americans, I've traveled the roads and highways in this country, and there are very few memorials. Okay? There are very few memorials to women. There are very few memorials to oppressed people. That's the historical reality.
You're absolutely, did everyone hear the brother, what he said? Very few memorials. The man who came up from Jackson State talked, and he told us there has never been one commemoration at Jackson State of the killings. And so there's something wrong. However, I do want to point out that there has been a tremendous staying power of anti-war, anti-interventionist sentiment in the population as a whole. And that's the reason we haven't invaded Nicaragua, and the polls have been consistent throughout the 80s, 60% or more against contra aid. And this is a reflection, I think, of residual feeling around the war. And I think that probably holds true to some extent here in northeastern Ohio, too. And yet, there's this terribly confused question of violence, of whose violence here. And granted, the press has screwed things up. But there's something about that slideshow that convinced me that, in retrospect, 20 years later, that something was wrong in our work. That's all I'm going to say. And I'm probably wrong. Okay. All right. Which leads me to Terry Robbins. I am very... The death of the four interests me a lot. I did not know them. The death of Terry Robbins interests me all the time, every day, because I knew him and I was involved. I was talking to Dave Klein from the Vietnam Veterans of America, who was here for May 4th, and he said, it's blood. When blood is shed, you have to think about it. You have to deal with it. You have to mourn. And Martha Norman said something similar about the importance of the fact that blood had to be shed so that black people would have the right to vote. And it's something about blood and something about death. I'm fascinated by death. I'm kind of like a death groupie. Whenever somebody dies, I go around and check out and see what happened. Yeah, no. When Abby Hoffman died, I immediately got on the phone and called New York and tried to figure out what was going on, and what had happened. And I have a theory about it, but we'll get into it. It's not important. It is important, but it's not appropriate now. I want to thank, this is a paper I started writing the minute after Alan called. I got off the phone and Alan called me. And it hadn't occurred to me to come and do this until he said it, and I immediately said, yes, I'll do it. And I also said, this is all I want to do. I don't want to be on a panel on big issues. I'll start. Carl, this morning's panel with Carl and Bernadine and Martha, and both Carls, spoke for me on the question question of the successes of the movement. I agreed with every word they said, even when they were contradictory. Everything was true, and I loved every minute of it. And that is what I believe. They established the context. I, however, want to discuss some questions about secondary issues. Everything that was said this morning was primary about the war and about the movement. That's the important stuff. That's what needs to be known. All I want to talk about today, this evening, is secondary issues. It's my observation that if you don't talk about secondary problems, they come back to haunt you, sort of like the movie Night of the Living Dead, where they come out of the ground. They're dead, but they're not, they don't stay there. And they come and they fight you, and then you become dead, just like them. And I think we can look at what's happening in the Soviet Union right now, and in China, and in Poland, and see that what was secondary has become suddenly what was primary. What was primary since the minute the revolutions happened was the hegemony of the Communist Party, the leadership of the Communist Party, and that was what was primary. And therefore, there would not be independent unions, and there would not be the right to strike, and there would not be independent student unions, and there would not be free speech, and everything else. And what was primary has been primary for so long that what was secondary and never openly discussed for fear of getting killed is now out in the streets. So that has changed my mind a lot. And I talked about these things with a lot of people. I passed around drafts of what I was going to say. And people said, oh, don't do it. Some people said, most everybody said, go ahead. But a few people said, don't do it. And I said, no, it's got to be done. In order to raise these secondary issues, I choose to talk about an individual, a real person. I don't want to talk about issues. I want to talk about a person. By looking at a real individual, we'll get to the issues. Terry Robbins was one of the founders and key energizing people here at the Kent SDS chapter. He was also a founder and one of the most important people in the first few months of Weatherman. Terry Robbins was among the first 3 of our friends and comrades to die. That was in March 1970, only 2 months after we had publicly proclaimed, in the end of January, we publicly proclaimed, or beginning of January, our desire to become urban guerrillas and bring the war home. The Revolutionary War, I might add. That was also 2 months before the shootings at Kent. And you can see how fast things were happening that spring. I thought there would be other speakers at this memorial to Terry. I originally thought it was going to be a workshop on Terry. And people would say what Terry did here, and I'd say what he did in the last few months. I thought these other speakers would praise him. At memorials, you're supposed to praise the exemplary attributes of the deceased. I imagine the purpose of this custom is to steal back some of death's victory. And you praise people, and so the attributes live with. If we mourn the dead properly, a part of the person lives on with us. The good parts live with us. To violate this formula, rooted deep in all traditions and logic, is to run a very great risk. Yet I propose to say some things about Terry Robbins' death and about Terry that are extremely critical. I hope someone will tell you about his work here at Kent. I hope after I'm done. His untiring energy, his desire to make the revolution, his ability to link seemingly disparate issues, such as the war and racism. His humor. Terry was, can we say he named the thing? The weather group or not? I don't know. Terry was responsible for the name of our document. You don't need a weatherman, whatever his name was. But it was a great, ironic name, which showed that we had, at least as long as we were taking ourselves seriously, we could also laugh at ourselves. And Terry was incredibly funny. His intelligence, his love. Any adequate memorial would include Terry's positive contributions. But there was another side to this amazing young man. I want to warn you at the outset that everything I say won't be true. You've already found that out. At best, it will be only a part of the truth. I'm bound to make some mistakes, to remember things inaccurately or in a self-serving way. I'll be wrenching Terry's death out of the context of his whole life. A few months ago, I wrote a letter to The Guardian about nonviolence, and all hell broke loose. Many people wrote in attacking both me personally as well as what I said. I didn't think what I wrote was so bad, though I did make a few errors which people took the opportunity to jump on. What I'm doing here, just as in the Guardian article, is thinking out loud, testing my ideas and formulations, asking for feedback. That's what I'm doing. I'm asking you to respond. I need your response. This has been troubling me for 20 years. I'm writing a book on it. I can't get my money until I finish the book. I can't finish the book until I figure out the question of violence. A second warning. When I describe Terry, I'm also talking about myself. I recognize my own capacity to do mental and physical violence. I also recognize my own capacity to change. And by extension, I recognize Terry's capacity to change. He was no monster beyond redemption. He was the same as me, and I think I'm a good person, and I'm here today. If there hadn't been a tiny little error with a wire and a battery, probably Terry would be sitting here laughing at us. And we love him, and so I don't want to fix him as a monster. I'd like to begin, that was all prologue. I'd like to begin by reading the opening few pages from a book I'm writing. My purpose in presenting this is to establish a groundwork of facts about Terry's death that I can then analyze, or we can analyze. Here's the portion. It is March 1970. I'm sitting with 6 or 7 others in a cavernous old cafeteria on West 57th Street in Manhattan. Outside, an early spring evening, still cold and damp. We're all young, white, fairly well dressed, obviously engaged in some sort of serious discussion. Undertones, no laughter or loud noises, no horseplay. Occasionally, one of us glances around nervously. We've been there for hours already, drinking one cup of coffee after another. The manager approaches, a short, middle-aged Jewish man, open face, wearing an apron, since he's bussing the tables himself. He studies us carefully, as if looking for his own kid. An index finger pops out, perhaps to lecture, but he says only 2 words: no bombs. We laugh half-heartedly. Don't worry, I say, we're good kids. A minute later, we leave. Scared to death, the manager may have overheard something he shouldn't have. Outside, we separate to the various safe nests we've found in the last few days, hoping that the man's comment was only reflecting the preoccupation of a city put on edge by screaming banner headlines. Townhouse razed by blast and fire. Man's body found. Radical bomb factory suspected in village townhouse. That cafeteria meeting was one of many I held that month with the survivors of the, quote, tribe, or collective, which had been based in the house on West 11th Street. We were trying to figure out what had gone wrong, going over and over the details. Diana Alton and Terry Robbins had been in the basement, putting together 3 bombs with timers made from cheap pocket watches. The design was such that when the minute hand got to a certain point, it would touch a screw added to the plastic crystal, closing the circuit to an electrical detonator cap, which in turn would set off the dynamite. As best we could figure, a wire had shorted while the timer was being assembled. Something simple, preventable, and yet quite inevitable. The blast rumbled upward from the basement. Neighbors reported hearing 3 separate blasts. Then the 4-story building collapsed onto our friends' exploded apart bodies. Ted Gold, who had been the vice chairman of the Columbia University chapter of Students for a Democratic Society just 2 years before, had gone out to the corner drugstore for cotton to muffle the ticking of the watch. He came back to ask Terry, the group's undisputed leader, what kind of cotton to buy, balls or bats. Why couldn't he make his own decisions, I wondered in anger. On his way out again, the stone lintel over the door collapsed on him, 1 step away from survival. Terry was doing all the thinking. 21 years old, small and wiry, smart as a whip, though by the time of the townhouse, his thinking was twisted. The night before, Terry had told me what was planned. We're going to kill the pigs at a dance at Fort Dix. It was to be 3 anti-personnel bombs made out of stolen dynamite surrounded with 16-penny nails for shrapnel. Non-commissioned officers and their wives and dates in New Jersey would pay for the American crimes in Vietnam. This is written for a naive reader, so at this point I put in 3 paragraphs about Vietnam. I often wonder what it was like to have been under the American bombs in Vietnam. They say the B-52s flew so high that you couldn't hear them. Perhaps you'd be out in a rice paddy up to your thighs in muddy water. You get the idea. And I'll skip them because I want to save time. I also talk about a little bit about the working in the movement for a long time. On that evening, I'll skip that. On that evening in early March 1970, I was already living in a clandestine weatherman collective in a tenement walk-up apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, planning other bombings and robberies. There were 2 collectives in New York, separated from each other for the sake of security. The other one was based in Kathy Wilkerson's millionaire father's townhouse on 11th Street. I had no contact with that group except through Terry as the overall leader in New York City. I assented when Terry told me the plans for the Fort Dix bombing, not that he was asking for approval. It was necessary, I thought, according to a simple political imperative. The war would not end until Americans became aware of what we were doing in Vietnam. Our task was to bring the war home. And we did. While the bombs were falling in Vietnam, a townhouse was exploding from inside in New York City. But through the intervention of some ironic or just God, it was 3 of my friends who died in that blasting fire. That's the fragment. That's the part. Not a very pretty picture of Terry or of myself. But for chance, I could have been in that townhouse. Terry, Diana Alton, and Ted Gold died in my place. I pondered this fact quite a lot in the last 19 years. What's worse is that had Terry and Diana and Ted not died that day, who knows how many innocent people would have been murdered by them. One could argue, and I do, that the townhouse was a good thing because it prevented a worse massacre of innocents. Why was our thinking so twisted? The first reason I alluded to in the passage I just read, Vietnam. I have a thing in there about how on the very day that the townhouse happened, Nixon announced that the war in Laos had been going on for 10 years and that we were going to continue the use of air power, which is the euphemism for you-know-what. That's in the fragment I just, missed. So anyway, just give me some credit. Don't think that I'm totally, The Vietnam War, which we had studied and internalized, drove us crazy. The U.S. government violated us as it murdered 3 to 5 million Indo-Chinese. We could not bear to be good Germans while our country committed mass murder. The historical precedent was too powerful. My generation came of age intuiting that our country is the Nazis of our time. That, in a sentence, is the essence of the problem in Vietnam, both for those who stayed home and for those who were sent there. The hurt was intimate. So many of the weather people, including Terry Robbins and Ted Gold and myself, were Jews. But there was more deep inside. Many of us were the white, privileged, middle-class beneficiaries of the system, well-educated, draft-deferred, never wondering where our next meal was coming from. This self-hate led to an amazing line that Terry held, that all white people are pigs. Whether we exempted or included ourselves was a source of much anguish. And I think this is, what I just described is not only true for the upper middle class kids from Columbia, but for a lot of people from Kent State also. Since we were fighting an absolute evil, a very predictable reversal ensued. We became the Americans we were fighting. The world has so many examples of this same phenomenon, in which people take on the characteristics of their enemies, that the dialectic appears to us as virtually iron-bound. The Jews escaped the ovens of Europe to become the racist occupying authority of Arab lands. Closer to home, the anti-communism and fear of the Cold War, the fear of the Russians, which is the organizing ideology for all of American foreign, military, and even domestic policy for the last 45 years, that fear has resulted in our countries behaving at least as bad in the world as the Russians are alleged to behave. Many psychologists have pointed out this element of projection and interpenetration in politics. In order to stop the government from blowing up Vietnam, and because nothing else appeared to be working, we were wrong in this, the anti-war movement was doing great and would eventually help end the war, my friends and I tried to do just as they were doing. Terrorize the enemy into submission. We claimed, modestly, that we were building a revolutionary movement, or a movement in our own image, naturally, that would make revolution. Exemplary military action would galvanize others into joining the struggle. The revolution was happening anyway, but our actions could lead it in the right direction, which we knew, of course. That direction was to smash imperialism through violence. The last few sentences could have been Terry talking back in March 1970 and in the previous few months. I remember him well, challenging us, cajoling us. We had to get, quote, get serious, move the struggle to a higher level, heighten the contradictions, kill the pig inside us and out, make leaps in consciousness, etc., etc. If any of you are young people trying to write papers or understand the 60s, you need to be aware of how seriously we took ourselves, how urgent we took our responsibilities. Many people, including other leftists, tried to warn us that our course was self-defeating and absurd. Isolated and proud, we answered with an unflagging, arrogant confidence that the world was exactly as we wanted it to be. In fact, fewer and fewer people joined the Weathermen, the more violent our actions and posturing became, but we didn't seem to notice. We actively denied the obvious because it didn't fit in with our ideas. Everyone knows that denial is as American as violence and cherry pie. We're experts at mass and individual denial. Look how we ignored the threat of planetary destruction that hangs over us as a result of our own weapons intended to increase our security. I know this. Albuquerque, New Mexico is teeming with nuclear weapons. And waste is going, nuclear waste is going through every day on the highways, and you cannot get anybody to talk about it. Look how our foreign policy in the Middle East, Central America, and Southern Africa is responsible for the deaths of millions and the suffering of whole nations, yet we still call our empire the free world, and the puny violence that develops in response, terrorism. The examples are endless. We weather people with our own self-delusions. We're just being good Americans. According to our dogma, it was absolutely necessary to further the revolution through beginning the inevitable armed struggle. The ruling class won't give up without a fight was a mantra we repeated to each other over and over. Have any of you ever heard that? The ruling class won't give up. This was our futile attempt to apply the lessons of the Third World to the United States. The beauty of Terry Robbins was that he had the courage to carry his thinking and his actions all the way to their inevitable conclusion. If thousands of people are walking around screaming, "The revolution has come," off the pig, "Time to pick up the gun," off the pig, then somebody really has to start doing it. The problem is that carrying your thinking out all the way to the logical end is usually stupid in the real world. It's childish and arrogant. Yes, sir?
Yes, on the question of violence, I think that's a very important theme for this conference. Since violence is an integral part of Marxist theory, I think that we have to recognize its importance and not just try to run away from it or blindly criticize it. I think we have to look at it in the context in which it occurs. I think there the critical words would be self-defense. If you have a system which is becoming violently coercive, that is just taking people and throwing them on planes and then throwing them out of planes effectively on peasants in foreign countries, in that case the system has become so violent that probably the only effective response is through violence.
Well,
now, it could be argued...
Okay, you'll be the first respondent. Okay, because some of the things I've mentioned, you'll be the first respondent. Okay, you can be the second. All right. It's childish and arrogant. This simple-minded tendency, along with denial, is also characteristic of our society, carrying things out to their logical end. But that's no excuse. I want to say, I honor people like Robin Marx, who chose to leave when we turned to guns. I believe your connection, and the connection of Jim and a lot of other people here, your connection to reality is stronger than mine. And I honor you for it. Terry was a very bright young person. I've just talked about arrogance and idealism. I'm moving along. Terry was a very bright young person who had infinite confidence in his own thinking. He prided himself on being in touch with reality. So did the rest of us. It just so happened that Terry's self-confidence, when mixed with his hurt and rage and his insecurities, produced a lethal mix. Terry was fascinated with violence and death. His favorite films at the end of 1969, right before we went underground to begin armed struggle, were Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Wild Bunch. For those of you who have never seen these two genre pieces, they both had something to do with charming, seductive outlaws who were pursued into the dark third world, where they go out in a blaze of glory, but not before killing many Bolivians and Mexicans. I didn't make it up. I think I don't make up any of my material. It's all there. For those of you who have blah, 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 these were truly sick movies, bloody, sadistic, no matter if film critics tell us how metaphoric they are. Terry saw both of them repeatedly in those last months. He definitely saw himself and the rest of us in these movies. Then he set out to create his own apocalyptic blaze of glory. One other horrendous thing I remember about Terry. He repeatedly beat his girlfriend. We in the leadership collective, the Weather Bureau, ignored, actually denied this was going on. Out of fear of Terry, and also because we didn't think it was relevant. Such a denial would never happen in the movement now. I'm positive of that. His violence toward the young woman he was with should have told us how bad off he was. Should have. Instead, we made him leader of our new organization. Think about that fact for a second. If you have somebody committing violence at that level, there are maybe 5 or 6 ideas that come to my mind about what to do with that person. With different results, they may or may not work. One of them is not to make him leader of an underground revolutionary terrorist or revolutionary group. And I think there's something twisted in us as well as him. Terry used his charm and intelligence on everyone. And when that didn't work, he resorted to bullying and verbal brutalization. You don't want the revolution enough. You've got the pig inside you. You're nothing but a liberal wimp. Those phrases were heard right here at Kent. And the rest of us, in turn, did the same to each other and those below us in the pecking order. For we had created, almost without thinking, one of the most hierarchical outfits this side of the Pentagon. Terry even developed an explicit theory of leadership, that leadership is those people who want the revolution most. I can best describe this theory as pure fascism. You remember the title of the 1930s German movie glorifying Hitler's rise to power? Triumph of the Will. Triumph of the Will. It's taken me a long time to understand what happened, mostly because I was in the middle of it and highly implicated. My best guess now, what I've just done so far is describe, and I'm trying to get to the reason why, and I may have done it or not. This is what it is. My best guess now, after so many years of searching, is to accept an explanation that the radical feminists have been bombarding us with for years. We were boys trying to become men through violence. Part of the problem was our fantasies of the masculine revolutionary hero, the Barbudos of Cuba, Fidel, Che, the martyr, Che. Violent, where we never transcended the violent, death-defying, death-seeking, death-loving hero. Look at these posters. I mean, look at this picture. All day I've been looking at this picture and thinking to myself, it's crazy to make a cult out of a man. It's nuts. I mean, it's as crazy as any other cult. Jim Jones. I don't want to talk about anybody's religion, but you know, the death of a male figure who will bring salvation through death. Have you ever heard that one? No? And Che, look at this picture of Che. I think it's obscene. You know, this is nothing against you, Steve, but I can't look at that picture anymore because we were in the cult of Che. I don't even like this stupid poster. You know, I could talk about that. I don't like it. It's just, I don't like it. I don't like it. I like Che. Che was a very interesting person. There's a wonderful novel about him called The Death of Che Guevara, but I wish I could have a look at this. All right, yeah. But cult is the problem. The cult of the hero. That's what a male hero. That's what I'm talking about. There's more. Sex, violence, and death were our currency for power. We embraced sexuality as we rushed to go out in a blaze of glory. It was the ideology of fucking our way to the revolution. What we were actually playing out was the common male belief of our culture. I'm going to get mine. I'm going to prove myself. Make my day. I'm going to be a man. Read my lips. I'm going to show you how big my prick is. All of this is normal stuff for men. Absolutely normal. Now I'm going to say something that will be a little controversial. We were not... a lot of people told me to take this line out, but I'm going to put it in. I know I'm wrong, and it's stupid, and it's a terrible line, and it's wrong in every respect. But we were not totally different from Oliver North, who plays the martyred, violent hero, or Frank Lorenzo, or any other jerk our country suffers under. How obvious we were. Maybe not quite so obvious. The fact that there were lots of women involved, including in leadership, allowed us to deceive ourselves. This is a touchy subject, and with all respect to Bernadine and my other sisters here, and all the other sisters, I would welcome more open discussion of their experiences. I suspect, I'm going to give it's a free country, I can say whatever I want, so I'm going to say it. I suspect that part of the answer is not too far from what the radical feminists say, that our sisters did not cease being victims of the men, and also of their own fatal need to prove themselves and to participate in male power. In this case, male power through mental and physical violence. For both Terry and me, political power and sexual domination over women went together. Might add, we exploited the line of smash monogamy so we could basically have access to any woman that we demanded. It was corrupt. It was sick. I think he was somewhat more death-loving than I, which is attested to by the fact that his start in the organization suddenly rose, and mine made a precipitous drop at exactly the moment when we chose to destroy SDS in order to build the armed underground. So I'm making a slight distinction because I survived and he didn't, but I might not have survived. But I think, deep down, I don't think I was death. I didn't like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I thought it was a terrible movie, and I thought the Wild Bunch was probably worse. I'm getting to the end now. This is it. The consequences in the real world of our actions. Very briefly, we helped demoralize the movement at the moment it was needed most. Remember Carl Oglesby's anecdote this morning of the Red Clover Farm. Remember that one? And several others that Robin had. Everybody's got their own anecdotes. 1969 and 1970 were the years when Nixon was beginning his confusing Vietnamization of the war, while simultaneously intensifying the war outside Vietnam in order to destroy as much as possible of Indochina. That was when the Nixon policy started, 69 and 70. Kent State, the shootings, and hundreds of other protests occurred in direct response to the invasion of Cambodia. Only SDS, the single largest student anti-war organization with over 350 campus chapters, was dead. We idealists, I mean that in the worst possible sense of the word, we idealists had already done it in, along with ourselves. Maybe nobody could have held it together. The centrifugal forces of factionalism and dogmatism were so great. I've heard that so often. You know, when I say, oh, we did this, I think that destroying SDS was the worst thing we've ever done, worse than killing those 3 people. No question, destroying SDS by far the worst. And I've told that to people for years. And when people say, well, nobody could have held it together, right? But we were no less responsible than PL or the other Marxist and Maoist sectarians. Believe it or not, we wanted to destroy SDS because it was too liberal. We wanted to. Does anybody remember that? We wanted to destroy it. Meaning it wasn't revolutionary. Thanks to Dave Klein, the brother who's a vet, I'm now calling this sort of thing, not just the political era, but the sort of factionalism that we did, I'm calling it mental violence and equating it with physical violence. Because I think he pointed this out to me. The left is addicted to mental violence. Well, today it's been beautiful, and in New Mexico we don't do any of it anyway. The left, I believe the left needs a 12-step program for mental violence addiction. We were unwittingly doing the work of the FBI. Government repression, infiltration, provocation are givens in any radical endeavor. There will always be that stuff. Always. But the amazing thing about Weatherman and the Weather Underground was how few infiltrators we had. To the best of my knowledge, we only had one. And he was very minor in the organization. The situation was different with the Panthers. But as for the Weathermen, we were totally responsible for our own fate. I'd like to modify that just a little. The paranoia that they created due to the repression caused us to go off that deep end. However, there's always that tendency towards paranoia. And I feel it right here, you know, in all the discussions for the last, since I've come on campus. There's always that tendency towards paranoia. The job is to overcome the paranoia and to keep going with our work and not let the paranoia be, and not let the repression be successful through paranoia, through fear. Ignore it. That's what I do in New Mexico. People say, oh, there's a cop parked outside taking pictures. I say, well, go take a picture of him. You know, don't make a big deal out of it. Don't make, it's my own tendency. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think it hurts us more to deal with this stuff. I think we should. I'll leave a discussion of why this country so rejects political violence. I wrote about this in The Guardian, and nobody paid attention to what I said, of why political violence can't work in this country. Nobody responded to what I said. You know, I'm going to leave it. If anybody wants to know why it can't work in this country, ask me after. Almost all branches of the left now reject a violent strategy for building a majoritarian movement. I'm going to repeat that. The goal is building a majority